I have just left Oscar Cunningham, the Ohio boy. He is in a dying condition. There is no hope for him. It would draw tears from the hardest heart to look at him. His is all wasted away to a skeleton and looks like someone 50 years old. Walt Whitman, Army Square Hospital, Washington, D.C., 1864. You are listening to In the Past Lane, the podcast about history and why it matters.
We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more
to huddled masses yearning to breathe
Consider
free.
that we shall be as a city upon a hill.
that all men and women are created equal.
Give me liberty or give me death.
Nobody's free until everybody's free.
The government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
History matters because it's not just about the past. History's about us, here and now. It explains the world we live in and why things are the way they are. And history gives us insights into how to achieve a more just, peaceful, and prosperous future. So people, let's do this. Hi everyone, welcome to In the Past Lane, the podcast about history and why it matters. I'm host Edward T. O'Donnell, your historian at large, and this is In the Past Lane, Episode 1. That's right. Numero uno. I hope we know what we're doing. We are coming to you this week from the posh and fabulously appointed Smoot Hawley Studios, located somewhere outside of Boston, Massachusetts. You can learn more about me, this podcast, and our guests at our website, inthepastlane.com, and on Facebook and Twitter, where I tweet as In the Past Lane. Guiding us along is our wonderful executive producer, Lulu Spencer. Thanks, Lulu.
Sure thing, boss.
Okay, anyway, this week's episode will focus on the new historical drama Mercy Street, which premiered on PBS this week. This series, set in a Civil War hospital and focusing on two women, one Confederate and one Union, has generated a lot of buzz, with some TV lovers and critics suggesting Mercy Street might become the next Downton Abbey. So here's the lineup. To kick things off, we'll start with some background on some of the underlying issues regarding medicine and death in the Civil War, by far the deadliest conflict in American history. Next in this episode, we bring you an in-depth interview with Lisa Wolfinger, the co-creator of Mercy Street. You'll learn what inspired her to develop this project, and what new and important insights about the Civil War she hopes viewers will take away from the series. In our final segment, it's time for Mercy Street Rewind. That's the feature where I bring in the Past Lane's senior historical correspondent, Megan Kate Nelson, to get her insightful analysis and commentary on the latest episode of the PBS historical drama, Mercy Street. But since we want to avoid dropping any spoilers on those of you who haven't yet watched the show, our Mercy Street Rewind feature will appear as a separate segment in this podcast feed. Okay, people, hop in. We've got plenty of room. Your journey in the Past Lane begins now. What comes to mind when you think of the American Civil War? For most people, the great conflict at the center of American history conjures up images of epic battles between soldiers in blue and gray. Battles like Antietam and Gettysburg. It brings to mind key figures like Ulysses Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman, Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. Many of these ideas and images are generated by popular culture. Everything from movies like Glory and Gettysburg, to documentaries like Ken Burns' series on the Civil War, to the many reenactor groups that stage mock battles in replica blue and gray uniforms. The one thing typically missing from the popular memory of the Civil War is a clear understanding of death, both the number of people killed in the war and how they died. Let's start with the number of people killed in the 4-year conflict. For a long time, historians pretty much agreed that the total killed in the Civil War, both Confederate and Union, was about 620,000. Then just a few years ago, a new study, using more advanced statistical modeling techniques, claimed that the real number was about 750,000, or even more perhaps. On its face, that is a staggering number, especially when one considers that the total population of the United States in 1860 was about 31 million. To put this in perspective, 750,000 deaths by 1865 is the equivalent of 7.5 million deaths in 2016. 7.5 million. Just think of the impact that many deaths in just 4 years would have on our society today. Just think of the impact that many deaths in just 4 years did have on American society in the years following 1865. Another important point to consider is how these soldiers died. Here again, popular culture depictions of the Civil War would have us believe that most perished in battle. This idea is reinforced by some of the stats that are associated with key battles. 25,000 casualties in a single day at Antietam, for example, or about 50,000 casualties for the 3 days of fighting at Gettysburg. Yet, the historical record is clear on this matter. Most of the people who died in the course of the American Civil War died from disease and infection. Now, this doesn't make their deaths any less meaningful or any less tragic. Indeed, that's how most soldiers died in warfare throughout human history. It's not until World War II, in the middle of the 20th century, that the primary cause of death for soldiers and sailors was injuries suffered in combat. So, why am I beginning this episode of In the Past Lane by talking about death and the Civil War? Well, it's because our next two segments focus on PBS's new historical drama, Mercy Street, which is set in a hospital and focuses on the lives of nurses and doctors who struggle not only with the great questions raised by the war, but also how to save lives in an era when medical science was quite primitive. Stay tuned. In the Past Lane is brought to you by, well, actually, no one. But we are totally open to sponsors. Maybe one of those free trade coffee outfits? Or one of those companies that mails you razors? Or maybe that one that helps you make your own website? Okay, pretty much anybody. Yeah, so sponsors, operators are standing by. Well, that's not true either. Just send us an email. Thanks.
I am just the place for you.
This man is a Confederate?
Blood is not gray or blue. It's all one color.
You want to be free, then you gotta take it.
You cannot start a war to save a union.
You cold-blooded savages!
You have no idea what you're signing up for here.
Dear God. Are you afraid? Do I seem afraid to you?
Mercy Street, only on PBS.
Welcome back to In the Past Lane. Like a lot of Americans, for several months now, I've been reading with great interest about the forthcoming PBS historical drama, Mercy Street. When it debuts in mid-January, it'll be the first PBS historical drama based on American history to air in a decade. Not surprisingly, anticipation for this series has been growing steadily in recent months. And so, it's my great pleasure to have with us on the line Lisa Wolfinger, co-creator and executive producer of Mercy Street. Lisa Wolfinger, welcome to In the Past Lane.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be on board.
You're the co-creator and executive producer of Mercy Street, and I'm wondering, just given your background, where your interest in American history comes from. It's clear from some of your previous projects on the Mayflower and on the Salem witch trials, just to name a few, that you seem to be interested in American history. So where does this come from?
Well, ironically, I am American, but I grew up overseas. My father worked for an international bank, and I left when I was quite young. So I actually developed my passion for history when I was at boarding school in England, and then I went to university in England. So my passion was really for European history. And I loved history because I love colorful characters, and, fact is always more interesting than fiction in my book. And then, of course, I moved back to the States and married my husband and ended up as a documentary filmmaker. And interestingly enough, I started getting commissions from History Channel specifically to make these big historical docudramas. And I have a background in theater, so I decided that really the best way to tackle a story that's set, now we're talking 1400s, 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, is to dramatize it, at least partially dramatize it, using the historic record. So I fell into making docudramas about early American history. And I made a series called Conquest of America about explorers coming to America. I made a special about the Salem witch trials and actually used transcripts from the pre-trials and dramatized those. And produced a big special for History Channel called Desperate Crossing, the untold story of the Mayflower, about the separatists that we call pilgrims who came over here. And again, fully dramatized that, actually, with some talking heads, some historians. So what I was doing that was a little different, I was telling a historical story, but using drama to do it and using actors to bring it to life, because I love history. I'm a historian at heart, but to me, history has to be brought to life and has to be made accessible. So I think my goal has always been to breathe life into history.
You're right in step with sort of a growing trend, certainly here in the States, that there seems to be insatiable interest in things historical. And sometimes it's documentary, but also the historical dramas that have been appearing on TV certainly seem to speak to that hunger that people have for history that's accessible and engaging, but it's also still rooted in good historical research and so forth.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I think that makes all the difference. I mean, it really needs to be rooted in historical research and fact. And all I'm doing is filling in the blanks. So Mercy Street's a different beast, of course. Mercy Street is fully scripted. And it's fully scripted because of the great joy and honor of working with David Zabel, who's my creative partner in this, who was the showrunner, lead writer on NBC's ER for many, many seasons. So he's a very experienced episodic TV writer, very smart writer.
Seemed like a great match in the sense of what each of you brought to the table, given is it not just TV drama, but TV drama set in a hospital.
Absolutely. So, yeah, a match made in heaven. I was able to really focus on the research, and he was able to take the research and run with it, basically. So I'm hoping that the combination is going to pay off.
It certainly seems like a very interesting choice of setting. That's one of the questions I wanted to ask you. You know, when people think about film and drama, anything really around the Civil War, it's usually about battles and battlefields. Think about movies like Glory and Gettysburg. So why a hospital setting? Do you think it has a special quality in terms of getting at certain things that might not come out in other historical settings?
Yes, absolutely. But just to take a step back, I mean, why not battles, especially with the Civil War? I mean, for me, history is interesting if it's at a human level and it's relatable, about themes that are relatable. Also, for me, I realized there was a great untold story about doctors and the first female volunteer nurses who were in many ways the unsung heroes of the Civil War. You know, for every soldier wounded in battle, there are dozens of caregivers behind the front lines trying to repair the physical and psychological damage, and that job was all the harder during the Civil War when medical science was in its infancy, and, you know, nursing really, for the most part, was the preserve of convalescing male soldiers who were not trained, they weren't sympathetic, and they were far from gentle. So these female volunteers were sorely needed, even though they were not welcomed, which, you know, I think we do a good job of portraying in our series. So why a hospital setting? The general hospital setting, especially since we can bring in North and South, because, of course, our hospital is located in Alexandria, Virginia, which was a southern town occupied by the Union all 4 years of the war. It was also very close to the front lines for certainly great chapters of the Civil War. So there was an opportunity to bring in Confederate patients, too, into this Union hospital, which we can justify in the historic record. So in a way, our hospital setting gave us a cauldron of conflicting voices and politics, and really allowed us to bring in all the big themes, all the central issues of the war, to bring it in almost on a stretcher into this world.
Yeah, and that seems apparent, the choice not only of being a hospital, but also essentially a border right on the front lines of where the two sides meet, provides a great context for people. And it also allows, it seems to me, what I've seen so far is realizing that people who came into these dramas were very complex. They're not just blue and gray. They're not just abolitionists and pro-slavery. That there's a lot of people that are truly conflicted on every level on these really core issues.
Yes, I mean, war is complicated, and certainly the Civil War was deeply complicated and very confusing. And so I think we were able to explore that with the variety of characters and voices that we have, from Mary Finney, who's a rather rigid abolitionist who believes she's on the right side, but also really has no empathy for the enemy, you know, for Confederate patients. Then we have a doctor who is a brilliant surgeon, has traveled overseas, has studied in Paris and London, and is quite enlightened in his thinking when it comes to medical matters. But he's from a border state, and his family are slaveholders, so he comes from a big tobacco plantation. And somehow in his head he can marry those two things. And
this is the Josh Radnor character, Dr. Jedediah Foster.
Yes, so he's a mass of contradictions. And of course those two characters come in conflict. You know, you have Sam Diggs, who is a free black man who was raised in an enlightened household in Philadelphia, was trained by a doctor, and is actually quite skilled medically and experienced. But of course he's not allowed to practice medicine, and he's not, you know, he'd never be recognized as a doctor, certainly in a Union Army hospital. So he's operating under the radar, trying to learn as he goes, always frustrated that he can't actually practice. And then Aurelia, who's our newly escaped slave, who's made it behind Union lines, who, you know, I don't want to give away too much, but there's something she's desperately trying to do. She's trying to be reunited with somebody who's very dear to her, and she will basically go to any length to make that reunion happen, and pays a price for it.
Yeah, I'd say those last two characters certainly seem to be the ones where you get a sense that we're going to learn a lot more about their backstories. Their backstories are very vague and very intriguing as a result of that.
Right, and certainly it's an ongoing episodic series, so we take our time developing these characters and learning about their backstories. And then, of course, we've got Dr. Hale and Nurse Ann Hastings, who, you know, we like to think of as our Frank Burns and Hot Lips, our homage to MASH. We definitely have MASH elements in this. And again, that's very much something we intended to do. We set out to do. We wanted to make sure that this drama had a sense of humor, not just because we think as dramatists that sense of humor or comedy is important to balance the drama, but because we actually found it. You know, we found it in the memoir. Mary Finney's memoir has passages that are laugh out loud funny. Louisa May Alcott was a nurse during the Civil War. She wrote a wonderful book called Hospital Sketches. And certainly she was one of our inspirations, and we borrowed from her and gave Mary Finney some of her attributes and some of her experiences. In fact, the staunch abolitionist part of it really is Louisa May Alcott.
That was one of my questions. I mean, clearly these are composite characters, and it seems, I'm wondering, some of them seem obvious, like Louisa May Alcott, but I was wondering also about Jedediah Foster. Is he the Dr. Jonathan Letterman, or at least there's hints that he's a brilliant innovator, which was what Dr. Jonathan Letterman, who was a famous Civil War surgeon, was famed for sort of inventing battlefield medicine in some ways. Yes,
one early iteration of this was about Dr. Jonathan Letterman and featured Clara Barton at one point, and was actually set in a field hospital. But I mean, certainly there's some inspiration there from Jonathan Letterman. But there were many doctors on the Union side and the Confederate side during this time who were what we call elite doctors, who had trained in Europe or had spent some time in Europe and were anxious to push the boundaries of medical science, were anxious to improve on the chaos, because it was true. At the start of the war, the Army Medical Department on both sides were a complete and utter mess. They were completely overwhelmed. They'd never seen a war like this. They'd never seen casualties on that scale. And so, you know, by the time you get to 1862, the spring, summer of 1862, you start to see some big changes, certainly on the Union side. There's a new Surgeon General Hammond, and of course Dr. Jonathan Letterman enters the picture. And these two worked very hard to transform the Union Army Medical Department into something that was a lot more efficient and was actively doing research and trying to improve on the state of medicine, if you will, at the time.
And I think that's probably going to be one of the many things that surprise viewers, is to see, because again, we rely on other ways. How have we seen Civil War hospitals? It's usually in other films, and they're usually very gory, and you get the sense that this is medieval medical science at work here: hacksaws, whiskey, and a leather strap to bite on. And what the record shows and what Mercy Street is indicating is that obviously in the moment, people aren't going to just simply rely on barbaric tactics that don't work. They're going to be thinking about what might work, what new tricks can we try that will stop bleeding quicker, and that sort of thing.
Yes, I mean, I think what most people don't understand is that the Civil War was actually a very exciting time in medicine, certainly American medical science. You know, for the first time you had basically country doctors who, I don't know, maybe they treated a few bumps and bruises, now in an environment, these general hospitals were very new. So in an environment where you have hundreds of patients now and they're suffering from wounds that you've never seen before, and certainly some are incredibly complicated. They're suffering from diseases you might not have experienced before. And so you're running around trying to make it up as you go, but along the way you're gaining experience. And then what Surgeon General Hammond did, which was so brilliant, he said, look, now start writing case studies. Send us those case studies. We will compile them. We will learn from them. And so that was really the great transformation during the war. The fact that these doctors had an opportunity to work on such a variety of patients and do such a variety of really interesting surgeries and then share what they learned with other doctors. And that's how you advance medical science. So, as I said, it was a very exciting time in medical science. And you get some really brilliant minds like our Dr. Foster, who's representative of these elite surgeons, who are grabbing the opportunity with both hands and running with it. What can I learn? How fast can I learn? How can I improve on these treatments? And oftentimes they were experimenting on themselves. And certainly that is a storyline we explore with Dr. Foster. But again, it's based on fact. It's based on quite a few doctors, actually, that we know of who experimented on themselves.
Yeah, it's really, really fascinating stuff. And actually, in a way, an aspect of most of our big wars have led to really significant leaps in medical technology. And I think the Civil War is probably the first one where that really occurs on a grand scale. So in a way, it's sort of an oddly comforting thing, given the carnage of the war, that there is, at the very least, some sort of upside, because all of this will be transferred into the civilian sphere after the war and make medicine just that much better.
Yes, absolutely. And, you mentioned Dr. Jonathan Letterman. He really did invent battlefield medicine and the whole system that he instituted of triage and field hospitals to general hospitals to then, convalescent camps or specialist hospitals. That's still in practice today.
I want to ask you a question about something I was doing a little bit of background reading, and I read in one of your interviews that you said you wanted Mercy Street to be entertaining and engaging, but also the phrase you use is that it's completely relevant to our lives today. And that's something historians always strive for, and I'm kind of interested in what you see in this 150-plus-year-old story. What exactly does it have to say to us in 2016?
Well, I think that all the themes that we deal with in Mercy Street, whether it's sexism or racism, tolerance, prejudice, polarizing politics, they're still absolutely relevant today. And I think we have a lesson to learn from our Civil War history, and that is, look what happens when polarizing politics reaches such a point that there's an actual divide in the country, and you end up with conflict. I think that is something we need to look at. We need to think about, because we've been through it, and it was horrible. It was a terrible, terrible time. And I think we just need to be careful today, because our politics, yet again, are very polarizing. And I just think we need to pay attention to our past. History is man's memory, and we need to pay attention to our memory. I have 4 boys. My youngest is 19. He's a freshman in college, and he actually, I hate to say this, but he goes to college at Gettysburg, and he knows nothing about Civil War history. I said, so, all right, when did the Civil War end? I don't know, 17-something. What was it about? Right. Oh, I don't know, slavery maybe? I don't know. And that, it's a little alarming. The Civil War was a defining moment in our history, and I think it's worth revisiting it.
Yeah, it's interesting. Even the Civil War, you'd think if there was one thing that, maybe not a teenager, but most Americans could put their finger on, it's the basics about the Civil War, because it is the great drama right smack in the middle of our history. First half of American history sort of leading to the Civil War in some ways, and then the rest of it post-Civil War, many of the same issues playing out. But it's always shocking and for historians and people doing history in various ways, such as film. It's in some ways disheartening, but it's also a challenge, because I think it reminds us that what we're doing is important, because it's trying to bring up people's knowledge base of the past, and also the past should be challenging. The past is not something that's easy. And there's certainly going to be, you can see in the early episodes, a lot of conflict that speaks to race and to class and to gender and things that are relevant very much to today's society. So that's going to be very interesting to watch play out. And By way of sort of wrapping things up, Mercy Street Season 1 is set in 1862, so I presume that means we're looking forward to several more seasons that carry us through the end of the war. Is there anything we need to keep an eye out for, or does that fall into the spoiler category?
Yes, our cunning scheme was to move very slowly through the war. So Season 1 only covers actually a couple of months in the spring-summer of 1862, so it's the start of McClellan's Peninsula campaign. And that was a decision we made early on. And because we would like to continue and tell the story of the rest of the war and these characters through the rest of the war. So we don't have an official green light yet for Season 2, but certainly it's looking very positive, and we're already breaking down story for Season 2.
That's great. Well, I think if people do want to imagine what's coming up next, just sort of consider what did happen in the second half of 1862 and the emergence of the Emancipation Proclamation and the key battles and key political struggles. So there's a lot. You can figure out some of the outlines yourself in anticipation of Season 2. But for now, I guess it's just enjoy Season 1.
Yes, I will say this much, that Season 2 would take us to Antietam.
Okay.
I'll share that much.
That's great. Well, Lisa Wolfinger, I want to thank you for taking time to speak with us at In the Past Lane. It has been a pleasure.
Oh, well, the pleasure is mine. Thank you very much.
Lisa Wolfinger is the co-creator and executive producer of the new PBS historical drama, Mercy Street, debuted on January 17th. We'll be right back.
You are listening to In the Past Lane, the podcast about history and why it matters.
If you are enjoying this podcast, then please subscribe to In the Past Lane at iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you access your podcasts. Subscribing is free, and once you do it, new episodes of In the Past Lane are automatically downloaded to your listening device. Subscribing also gives you access to the entire back catalog of In the Past Lane episodes. And if you do subscribe, please leave a review. Thanks.
Well, people, all good things must come to an end, including this podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Hopefully, we've given you something to think about. If so, please find us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to follow us and to leave us your comments, questions, and suggestions. I also encourage you to check out our website, inthepastlane.com. There you'll find a show page for this episode that includes links, essays, images, and further reading suggestions related to everything we've discussed in this episode. And you'll find show notes that will tell you all about the music you've heard in this episode. At inthepastlane.com, you can also learn more about our guests, correspondents, and other contributors. And please, people, you know the deal. It really helps the In the Past Lane podcast when loyal listeners like you subscribe to it at iTunes or Stitcher. And of course, please leave a starred review and comment. Thanks. And don't forget, you can catch Megan Kate Nelson's insightful review and commentary about the latest episode of PBS's Mercy Street in our Mercy Street Rewind feature. To avoid spoilers, Mercy Street Rewind appears as a separate segment in this podcast feed. In the Past Lane has been made possible by the hard work and dedication of many people. They include technical advisors Holly Hunt and Jesse Anderson, podcasting consultant Daryl Darnell of Pro Podcast Solutions, photographer John Buckingham, graphic designer Maggie Salucci, website by ERI Design, legal services Tippecanoe and Tyler 2, social media management The Pony Express, risk assessment Little Bighorn Associates, growth strategies 5440 or Fight, and of course 1,000 thank yous to our executive producer Lulu Spencer. Special thanks also to Jay Graham for creating the intro music for this podcast, and to the Free Music Archive for providing the rest of the music for this episode. I'm In the Past Lane's host, Edward T. O'Donnell, your historian at large, reminding you that history explains our world, so let's pay attention to it. Thanks for listening. We hope you'll join us next time for another journey in the Past Lane. Lulu, you get the last word. Go.
What time is it?
SBI, Snoring Beagle International.